against which to look at the huge array of material in this very comprehensive volume. I want to start by saying that my name is Kate Maher. I have been linked to smuggling for a long time. I actually did my initial research, my master's, and my very first published article on smuggling. Max Galin is my graduate student, and you can see I got him into smuggling. And Florian is also former ID. I didn't influence his interest in smuggling, but he's definitely run with it in very interesting ways. And from that long perspective and experience with smuggling, I can say that this is a fantastic book. Not only does it have a great deal of material in it, but it really offers really interesting perspectives and a very illuminating understanding of what smuggling is all about. Now, I hasten to add, particularly for all of the PhD students and graduates in the audience, that this book, The Handbook of Smuggling, is not a how-to manual to help unemployed graduates make a non-academic living. It is, in fact, a book about understanding smuggling and its role, the lens it gives us into the shifting realities of transnational informal economic processes, which is a slippery, complex, and very exciting thing to look at in this highly unstable, informalizing, transnationalizing world. This is not the first anthology of smuggling, and it certainly won't be the last. But what it does differently from other anthologies is to examine diverse actors, activities, and effects of informal transnational economic processes without a specific ideological or regional focus. So it really has something for everybody. Previous great anthologies of smuggling have looked at particular regions or at particular perspectives. Some of them, like Asiwaju's Partitioned Africans, looked at how smuggling actually encourages regional integration and Pan-Africanism. Other anthologies, like the work by Johnny Egg and Ige, have mapped circuits of smuggling and tried to understand the diverse economic forces driving smuggling, that economic disparities rather than conflict were an issue. But since the late 90s, the issue of conflict has been fundamentally associated with smuggling in ways that I think this book addresses and tackles in an extremely open-minded but exciting way that really digs into why and what the implications are of the relationship of conflict and smuggling. The various ideas about smuggling as a mechanism for state failure, but also smuggling as a mechanism for state building. And this book really looks at the diverse ways in which smuggling shapes states, economies, and societies, and is shaped by them. In a variety of settings, it interrogates rather than assumes the idea that smuggling is primarily about conflict and criminality, and engages really in a myth-busting function rather than trying to promote a particular type of agenda. It examines where smuggling signals a breakdown of states and economic regulation, and where it is part of processes of rebuilding, of peacemaking, and even of economic transformation. We see in the course of the various chapters how in some places there are conflicts between, conflicts and the involvement of smuggling. See smuggling become a force for peace or for a resource for freedom fighters, as well as a resource for dissidents. And certainly Peter Andreas's work on peace in this book very much picks up on that idea. It also examines the range of actors involved, not just mafias and criminals, but business people, communities, corporations, even states. And Shalaka Thakker's article really looks at the idea of the various actors involved in smuggling in the Myanmar-India border and the ways in which they play very unanticipated and unexpected roles. We can remember, for example, the story of China's Opium Wars, where in fact states actually backed smugglers and punished a state that was trying to regulate smuggling. So certainly the interaction of smuggling and states moves in a number of surprising and unanticipated directions. And then we have the interrogation of the greed and grievance narrative in a way that shows that smuggling is, yes, indeed, sometimes associated with greed, but often also with livelihoods, peace building, state building, and a variety of other roles depending on context. And that is really something that this book does very well. It puts smuggling in context to allow us to see the very different things which smuggling does in the political economy of contemporary globalized economies. But smuggling also examines the complexities of commodities, routes, circuits, and regulatory processes, which are picked up very much in Annette Eidler's article in this anthology. So we see in a number of ways how smuggling does various different things, but also how academics do various different things with smuggling. How ideology often overrides the actual processes taking place on the ground and casts smuggling as fundamentally associated with conflict and criminality, with various types of nefarious or structural adjustment busting processes. And another thing that this book takes on is the whole idea of the role of ideology in shaping the way that we look at smuggling, and in thinking about how smuggling could be better analyzed and better looked at. This book is also full of delicious contradictions, things like the ways in which ceasefires reduce conflict but increase smuggling, the idea of smuggling receipts as one goes through the smuggling process, the state views of permissible and non-permissible smuggling, which come up in a number of the articles, and the idea that smugglers also have moral views on what should or should not be smuggled. There are so many contradictions and intriguing twists. There is fun to be had by all, as well as intellectual insight in the various ways in which the wide range of articles on goods, commodities, regions of the world, actors, help us to understand how contraband and conflict interface with smuggling in unanticipated as well as anticipated ways. So what I would like to do now is to turn over to our various presenters to talk a little bit about their own chapters. We'll go over to our presenters. So I present Max, who is a researcher at the Institute for Development Studies, and Florian Weigand to tell you more about this book.
Yes, thank you. It's a very unfortunate position speaking in between Kate and Peter, but I will provide a really brief introduction to this book, repeating some of the things that Kate already said, but less eloquently. But I have slides, so I will just quickly put those up. There we go. Can someone unmute themselves and tell me if they can see that? I'm seeing a thumbs up from Peter, so that is what I'll go with. Okay, yes, thank you very much, Kate. I'll provide a really brief introduction to the handbook to which all the panelists have so kindly provided chapters, time, and insight over the last couple of years, and talk a little bit about why we thought that this book was useful to have and what is in it. And as Kate already pointed out, I think one of the primary motivations behind this was really the idea that while regionally focused, thematically focused, argument-focused volumes around this topic exist, the idea of a handbook that brings that together from different perspectives really wasn't quite there. So that was kind of one of the driving forces behind putting this book together. Now, obviously, while Handbook of Smuggling didn't exist yet, other books on smuggling do exist. And when we look at their covers, the volumes of the panel excluded, I think I need an entire slide just for Peter's output. But if we look at the covers of these different books, a couple of really interesting patterns emerge. We've got our historical books that often see hand-drawn or oil-painted figures, either usually brandishing weapons, or already established as these figures in the darkness and the moonlight, bringing things across. And that interestingly, if we look at the lower part of the slide, that often translates into the more modern representations, which again, usually have shadowy figures on their covers, often brandishing weapons, and often there's an entire genre of pictures of people standing next to piles of confiscated drugs and arms. And then if we kind of move to the left side of the slide, again, an entire genre of books that somehow imply that this is all connected, and that, you know, we've got money and tusks, or we've got guns and cannabis and people all on the same cover. So while these different covers clearly represent something about smuggling and some perception of smuggling, we felt like they didn't entirely represent where a lot of the scholarship on smuggling has been in the last couple of years. So we think as a contrast to that, the cover that we chose for this handbook, and that we've gratefully been able to find by the Mexican artist Fernando Tovar, this image encapsulates, I think, a couple of things that we were hoping to do with this book. And the first thing is that it is centered around people, that even though most of the chapters here are about smuggling goods, they're also at the same time about people. And that the people here are not wearing shadowy garbs, they're not under the moonlight, and they're not holding guns. That there's a less of a sensationalizing aspect here in how people are presented. But what we also really liked about this is that the border across which things are smuggled here isn't a wall, it's not a line in the sand, but it's a somewhat opaque structure that is held by humans. And we thought that quite nicely represented one of the insights that really runs throughout a lot of the chapters, which is that borders are humanly made constructs. They're socially, politically, economically shaped constructs, and we need to analyze them alongside with smuggling, not taking them as given and just smuggling as the transgression. And one of the things that we also liked about this cover is that it emphasizes different perspectives. It emphasizes how perspectives shift and change. If you look through the kind of structure in the middle here, that the colors change, which we thought kind of quite nicely is echoed in a chapter in the book on smuggling narratives, which talks about the fact how stories start changing when you get across the border. We also think it's quite a lovely and lively picture, and perhaps as that also represents the book quite well. So the idea here was really to bring together and center contemporary social science scholarship on smuggling in a resource that is accessible to different audiences. As Kate said in the beginning, it is unfortunately not a handbook on how to smuggle, but we hope that aside from that, almost everybody who comes to this finds something useful. We hope that people who are interested in doing work on this, especially junior scholars, find this beneficial, not just at a starting point in learning about different commodities and discussions, but especially that there's a lengthy section that discusses methodologies of how to study smuggled, how we've smuggled it in the past and how it's shaped this field. We also hope that more experienced scholars here come together in a resource that broaches methodological boundaries, regional boundaries. I've really found reading the different chapters about different goods back to back and seeing, how writing about gasoline smuggling is different from writing about cane smuggling, and the kind of comparisons that already emerge in that are hopefully useful. And one of the things that we're proudest of in terms of making this accessible to audiences beyond the academy, and especially also in a policy space, is that the entire book is open access. We've bought the domain www.smuggling.page. So if you head there, the entire book can be downloaded as a PDF, as can individual chapters. What you will find there are, aside from an introduction, 6 broader sections. One is, as I just mentioned, on methods and approaches. One is on borderlands and their people. One compares smuggling different goods. One brings in insights from the study of human smuggling and mobility. One focuses on policies around addressing smuggling. And then, as will be the focus of this today, one is around smuggling and conflict. Now, I've said the word "we" quite a lot of times, and I think it's really important to emphasize here that while Florian and I kind of provided some introduction and editing of this. It's really the work of a huge community of people that have very kindly set time aside during 2 years, which were not easy for everybody involved, to contribute to this volume and to stick with it. So here I think is, I think, quite a lovely overview over the large number of people that have come together to make this book happen. And a lot of them are on the panel today. So without much further ado, I will stop here and pass on to Florian.
Thank you very much, Max. So before getting into the panel discussion, I thought I'd just share some of the insights with you from the various chapters that engage with the theme of today, clashes and contraband. So we have a body of chapter that really looks at how do borderlands and war economies ultimately function and how does smuggling fit in. And of course, war puts many people at hardship and makes business also very difficult for most people who live in a war zone. But there are some traders, business people, smugglers who tend to benefit from these kind of environments. And Aisha Ahmed, in her chapter in which she analyzes Afghanistan, Somalia, and Mali, really illustrates this really well. And as Kate mentioned earlier, it is not just business people who sometimes can benefit from a war economy, but it's also state actors and non-state actors that tend to benefit. And Shala Katako, who will be talking later, illustrates the smuggling economy in Northeast India at the Burmese border and illustrates how non-state armed groups as well as state actors benefit from what's happening there through taxes and levies. And that kind of quite naturally gets us to the question, okay, how are these borderlands actually organized? How do they function? And Jonathan Goodhand, Jan Köhler, and Jasmine Bhatia have a look at the Afghan borderlands and develop a typology where they look at different kinds of trading routes and who's benefiting from each of them and what kind of brokers are actually involved and enable each of them. And this is embedded in a fascinating analysis of 2 life histories of 2 of these brokers in Afghanistan. And then the question evolves, okay, so what happens if we try to disrupt these economies? What's actually often done in the policy sphere, or often intended? And David Brenner analyzes this and kind of concludes that they often tend to fail, at least in terms of the objective of reducing violence and insecurity. And he embeds this finding in a study of both sanctions in the DRC, aiming at the conflict minerals or so-called conflict minerals, and state policies in Myanmar that were aiming at undercutting the benefits that rebels make from the smuggling economy. And then we have a couple of chapters, and Max mentioned them earlier, that look at different kinds of goods. Licit goods, illicit goods. Of course, these words are really tricky to use in such a context. Legal, illegal, whatever we want to call them. Also conventional and unconventional. And Kate mentioned it earlier as well. Max mentioned it earlier. We have one fairly unconventional good, and that is narratives, because Marijke Chamaris and Lotje de Vries look at the borderlands of South Sudan and the Central African Republic and look at how a narrative about a specific violent incident is transformed when crossing a border. Hugely fascinating. Then we have a chapter by David Mansfield who looks at the smuggling economy with regard to opium in Afghanistan, and he really illustrates how what's often viewed as this highly organized economy where a lot of money is being made is actually highly embedded in a local economy where actually many people don't make much money at all. And it's much more, he shows this very well, loosely interconnected business people who are involved in this economy. Then Angelica Duran Martinez looks at Colombia and cocaine smuggling, and she adds the geopolitical perspective. So she illustrates, of course, we need to understand the local political economy, the coca farmers, law enforcement, whoever is involved, but we also need to embed this in an analysis of geopolitics. And in this case, particularly the US, because the US on the one hand is the biggest consumer market of cocaine, but it's also the biggest enemy of the drug at the same time. And that has been shaping how cocaine smuggling has been working for the last 100 years. Then Nicholas Marsh and Lauren Pinson looks at arms trafficking, and they really illustrate how unique arms trafficking ultimately is, because it doesn't require many people to traffic weapons, and it also often doesn't require a lot of money. And very interestingly, and they illustrate that often state actors are involved because it is part of the political objectives of governments to supply other countries with weapons. And then Annette Adler, she'll be talking much more about this in a few minutes, but she's talking about how these various goods intersect, and she talks about these trafficking nodes and how they link to insecurity. And then finally, Peter Andreas, who will also be talking a little later, looks back at history and illustrates that this connection, this complex connection between illicit economies on the one hand and conflict on the other hand perhaps is not as new as we may think, and how it has played a massive role in shaping US history and contributed to the formation of the US state. Right, on that basis, thank you. I think I'll hand over back to Kate for the panel discussion. Or I'm handing straight over to Annette, I'm not sure. Kate,
no, oh, back to me. All right, so let us meet our panel. So we are going to start with Annette Eidler. I've got the order correctly now. Start with Annette Eidler, who is the Director of Studies at the Changing Character of War Center, Senior Research Fellow at Pembroke College, and the Department of Policy and International Relations, all at Oxford University. So one of the things about being involved in smuggling is people have these really long job titles for the most part. So Annette will talk to us about her chapter. We will second have Shalaka Thakur, who is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And finally, we will have Peter Andreas of long-term smuggling fame, the John Hay Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown University. So I will hand over first to Annette to talk to us about her chapter on smuggling circuits.
Right, can you see my screen? Yeah, great. Just to clarify, I've changed positions, so I'm actually the director of the Global Security Program, but still based at Oxford and at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford. Thank you so much for inviting me, first of all, to this fascinating panel, and congratulations to Max and Florian for putting together this really, really fascinating volume, which I also can just highly recommend for anyone to use in their classes, in their studies. So I'm going to talk about briefly the importance of analyzing the interconnectedness of illicit flows rather than just studying them individually. I will also just put my timer. And that is really to better understand how they operate, what their social, economic, and political implications are, and also to identify possible entry points to tackle these illicit flows. So basically, I'd like to show how we can conceptualize the intersections of smuggling flows as trafficking nodes that form part of illicit supply chain networks. And that then shows their unique role in terms of 4 dimensions. So we can look at 4 dimensions, which are, first of all, the input-output structure, then secondly, the institutional context, thirdly, the territoriality, and then fourth, the governance structure of these networks. And so basically, these trafficking nodes, they hold the networks together. And while bringing livelihood opportunities for local communities who reside in locations that function as these trafficking nodes, they also make these communities extremely vulnerable to abuse by both non-state and state actors. So linking to what was mentioned before, the focus on communities, on people, I'd also like to hear just highlight what this means for people on the ground. So just briefly, how can we think about illicit supply chains? Well, usually we tend to think about it as a linear chain, as you can see here on this slide. So we start with the resource extraction. It can be coca, it can be poppy, for example. And the next step is the processing, to process the raw material and into the, for example, the illicit drug, cocaine, heroin, and the transport, first domestically within a certain country, internationally, the trafficking, and that then leads to the market. But actually, it looks a little bit more complex because it's a network or networks of networks. So what we can see here is how this linear chain is actually connected through other types of illicit flows. And these are exactly these intersections, the interconnectedness that I mentioned. So here you can see, for example, that we need flows of precursors, for example, chemicals or gasoline, to process the raw material into the final drug. So there is an intersection here. Another intersection is with barter agreements. So if we think about those unstable regions, the conflict settings that Florian and Max also mentioned at the beginning, we know that often different parts of the territory are controlled by different armed groups or different local actors. So if someone wants to actually transport their illicit drug or arms or whatever the good is through that territory, they often have to have arrangements with those groups who control that, for example, by exchanging arms with drugs to be able to pass through the territory or just pay for it. Then another connection is, of course, money laundering. The money, the profit made through the trafficking needs to be reinserted into the legal economy. So there's another flow, a financial illicit flow that's also intersecting. And all of that is coordinated at logistics centers, which can be physical spaces, but they're also increasingly in the cyberspace, virtual spaces, which makes it even harder to trace. And then in order to coordinate all of that, there needs to be a mechanism, there needs to be a facilitator, an intermediary, which can be the financiers at the kind of lower end or the more powerful brokers at the other end. So now what does it mean in terms of the input-output structure, the first dimension that I mentioned? Well, first of all, analyzing illicit supply chain networks in line with the input-output structure sheds light on the expertise that is necessary to coordinate and connect various flows. And I'm just sharing here a quote from fieldwork. So quote, where someone explained to me what this means, the route. The person said, "We often hear about the term route. Delinquents even sell routes. In the criminal sphere, when they say that they sell a route, what they really sell is the logistics chain of the business. This includes the know-how, the information on how it works, and who is involved." End of quote. So it's not just about the physical space. It's really understanding how all of that is connected. So who produces, who has the land to produce the raw material? How are the precursors then entered into that? Where are, let's say, the laboratories, for example, to process that? It's all the expertise around that. And once we analyze the input-output structure, we get a sense of these connections in between. Now, the second dimension that I mentioned is the territoriality. And that's important because each locality has a specific function or role within the networks. So I'm just showing here this map of the cocaine supply chain, where we can see what's relevant in terms of the different parts of the territory. Here, for example, you see that the starting points starting in the Andean regions are at the coast. So we know that strategic starting points of international trafficking routes are typically located in harbor towns, at border areas, whereas production sites are usually in more central regions. Now that's important, again, if we want to make a link to insecurity or conflict, because we know that in those strategic trafficking nodes or the starting points, this is where often we see more violence. This is where there are unstable arrangements among different actors. So that's where violence erupts. Whereas in the production side, we might not necessarily see the same type of violence. So understanding the territoriality, understanding what kind of function each step has, the locality has, that gives us a better sense also of how it links then to conflict. Then the third dimension is the institutional context. And typically weak state governance systems characterize the institutional context of illicit supply chain networks. In many marginalized areas in unstable regions, for example, state representatives are absent. In such contexts, local populations have few legal economic opportunities to sustain their livelihoods. And that's exactly why we see many of them involved also in forms of smuggling. Now, the issue is that these small-scale smugglers involved may actually still intersect with the large-scale flows. And so the small-scale smugglers, even if they're not directly involved in those large-scale forms of trafficking or basically organized crime, they often have to pay taxes, for example, to the violent non-state group that controls the route for the purpose of the large-scale trafficking. Now, what this means is that it puts these smugglers into an extremely vulnerable position. Often they suffer abuse by the armed actors, but they can't really turn to the local authorities for help because, of course, they are themselves involved in an illegal business. So this then creates a dilemma, and we really need to think hard about what happens once we disrupt flows of large-scale trafficking for those local communities who might be involved in different ways. And again, it's about the intersection that matters here. And then finally, the fourth dimension is the governance structure. And that's related to the division of labor that often exists along and across those different supply chain networks. So here what's important are these brokers, the intermediaries that connect the different links. And these are often people, individuals that are perceived to be trustworthy and reliable by all the different groups involved. And that's often across the ideological spectrum. So they have typically also networks across sectors in society. They might be connected with the local political and economic elites, with civil society, but also with the armed actors if it's in a conflict setting. And that partly overlaps with the concept of warlords. But of course, they can also be powerful entrepreneurs that operate both in the upper or underworld. So looking at these connections, and that's again at the nodes, we better understand what makes the networks actually resilient. So just to wrap up, what are then the implications here, both for how we study it, but also for how we think about what the entry points might be in order to mitigate those illicit flows. But first of all, we need to challenge state-centric concepts to study the intersections of illicit flows, because in the end, these flows obviously reach across borders. So it's important to obviously then also adjust our studies to that. And secondly, we should map the interconnectedness of illicit supply chain networks to identify disruptors rather than just focusing on individual supply chain links. Now that means centering scholarly attention on the mechanisms that link different supply chain networks instead of just focusing on individual flows in isolation. And then finally, we need to study the moral economy of illicit supply chain networks, not just the political economy, to understand the role that these networks have for people's daily lives. So where legal livelihood opportunities are scarce, what is legitimate does not necessarily map onto what is legal. And this has consequences, obviously, for entire interrelated legal and illegal and formal and informal markets. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We'll move now to Shalaka Thakur, who is going to talk to us about smuggling systems on the India-Myanmar border.
Yes, can you see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you. So in my chapter, I have explored the role that insurgents play in the smuggling economy at a very important crossing at the Indo-Myanmar border. And I'm going to start with some context. So this big black dot that you're seeing on the left-hand map, that's roughly the border crossing that I was looking at. And on the right, you can just see a simple Google map image. The white line is the border. And I was focusing more on the Indian side, on the border town of More that you can see here. Now, according to local businessmen and the military who are placed in More, the informal and illicit smuggling economy is to the tune of close to €1 billion each year. And apart from all this trade, what you also have is the presence of over 6 non-state armed groups in the region, most of whom are fighting for secession or greater autonomy. Some of them continue to be in open confrontation with the Indian state, and others are in some version of a ceasefire or what they call a suspension of operations. What's also coming with the presence of these non-state armed groups is, of course, a very heavy Indian state security presence. The state of Manipur, in which More is, has a population of just 3 million. And for this population, you have 50,000 security personnel, most of whom are disproportionately situated at the border. What I tried to do was to understand the role of armed groups by talking to the smugglers and the traders on how they encountered them. But at the same time, I also tried to speak to the armed groups to see how they perceived their own involvement. And I think this quote encapsulates that quite well. Over here, they say that what we want is what we are entitled to, and also make a reference to their land and to tax required to carry out trade. So in many ways, it sounds much the same way a state would talk about why they levy any kind of tariff. What's even more interesting is that for most traders and smugglers, they don't really see a difference between state and non-state actors. The most common way to be involved in the smuggling economy at this crossing is by way of taking a cut or a fee on the goods that are passing through. And both parties do this, both the armed groups as well as the state actors who are present there. There are a few non-state armed groups who are actively involved in the businesses, but this is by no means the norm. For a normal trader, if they were to just go 100 kilometers across Myanmar into India, they would be stopped at least 9 times for informal fees by state and non-state actors. And armed groups at this crossing are playing a considerable role in shaping the smuggling economy the way it stands now. Many traders, of course, are resorting to smuggling to avoid state tariffs, and that's a whole other thing. But even if a trader was capable of paying state tariffs and was willing to and wanted to pay state tariffs, having to pay armed groups plus pay these tariffs becomes too unfeasible. And this makes just giving bribes along the way more feasible in comparison. Another way in which armed groups are shaping the smuggling economy is by creating a sort of barrier to entry. A teak smuggler who I interviewed called them business partners. He spent a large part of the interview talking about how threatening they were and how parasitic, but also used the term business partners because while he can negotiate this, they become a very formidable actor for any other potential competitors. Finally, what armed groups have also done, albeit indirectly, is brought in this huge presence of state actors, of Indian state actors, most of whom are also collecting informal fees. In fact, being posted here is seen as so lucrative that police personnel pay up to 6,000 euros, depending on their rank. So this would be for a higher up officer, just to be posted in this region. Their willingness to take bribes instead of enforce tariffs is, of course, in this situation, quite pragmatic. But at the same time, it's cementing the smuggling economy, the smuggling ecosystem even further. Also, the ways in which armed groups are involved vary. I mentioned earlier that you have groups that are in open confrontation and also groups that are in ceasefire. The groups that are openly fighting the Indian state still usually are across the border on the Burmese side. What they do is they levy large taxes, maybe annually, on many traders. But when it comes to this kind of taxation of goods crossing the border, they're unable to do it in a systematic way. It's much more ad hoc, their involvement. But when it comes to the groups that are in ceasefires, it's led to a great reduction in violence. People are not threatened as much, but at the same time, it's led to a systemization and regularization of sorts. Traders would talk about how armed groups always took from them, but now, since the ceasefires and suspensions of operations, they no longer have to do it on the sly. They've quite literally put up a gate in some places, and as I myself have observed on occasion, these gates or checkposts are often just like a stone's throw away from security forces checkposts. All right, so this is just a nice picture of the terrain, so you get some context of what it looks like on the way to Moreh. And the idea of this chapter was to understand the role that armed groups play in the smuggling economy. And I think in this context, it's very convoluted and varied. Far from the smuggler and armed group nexus against the state, here what we're seeing is some very counterintuitive associations. Firstly, in many ways, armed groups are shaping the cross-border ecosystem much in the same way that states are, by creating barriers to entry, by regulating who can do business and how, just different non-state barriers. Secondly, the presence of armed groups has led to an excuse for a great deal of state actors and state corruption, which has now become the de facto way of doing trade across this border. And finally, that ceasefires and suspension of operations have led to a regularization and systemization of the smuggling economy and have allowed groups to have more than an ad hoc engagement, can tell us also about how smuggling can be seen as a way of buying peace almost. But at the same time, it's important that these non-state actors exist, that the conflict continues at least to a certain degree for this kind of ecosystem to continue. So in an ironic way, while the presence of conflict in non-state armed groups has shaped the smuggling economy, this economy has in turn shaped the conflict, and it's kept violence in check by enabling that so many actors are able to get a piece of the pie. Yeah, and that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, we end up back where we started. We're turning to Peter Andreas, who is the Hay Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Brown, to talk to us about the various ways in which smuggling interacts with wars for good or for ill. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Kate. And thanks for including me today and also including me in the volume. My biggest gripe with these type of handbooks is the price. My biggest, and this one, to my great surprise, as pleased to see, open access, as Max pointed out. So the book is truly a distinct contribution for all the reasons Kate pointed out at the beginning. There's really no other book quite like it. So congrats to the editors. Thanks for taking the initiative, putting this together. I certainly will use it for teaching in future years and so on. My chapter stands out sort of in the volume as taking a very historical turn. The relationship between illicit trade and conflict is often treated as a distinctly contemporary phenomena, indeed a key characteristic of so-called new wars. This includes the use of so-called conflict commodities, timber, ivory, diamonds, drugs, to fund wars, looting and diverting humanitarian aid, diaspora funding, and so on. But this contemporary novelty is, often asserted rather than actually truly demonstrated. So my brief chapter provides a bit of a corrective to this tendency by bringing history back in, placing it more front and center in the analysis. And I actually would say, if I have only one complaint about the volume, a criticism, is that there's not enough history in the volume. And so I was particularly happy to make a contribution in that regard. So, I argue, the illicit trade and conflict connection really, it doesn't just go back years or decades, but in fact, centuries. And nowhere is this more evident than the very founding story of the United States, early US history. I would argue that the very founding of the country can't be explained without understanding smuggling and the relationship between smuggling and armed conflict. Just very briefly, since I don't have a lot of time, the details are in the chapter. I also wrote a larger book called Smuggler Nation, How Illicit Trade Made America, where I cover some of this in more detail. Just look at the War of Independence itself. Smuggling was essential in the outbreak of the conflict and then in the very conduct of the conflict. Smuggling itself helps to explain why the colonies revolted in the first place. Merchants balked when the British Royal Navy, which had been deputized essentially as a customs force by the king, by the crown, they revolted because Britain started cracking down on smuggling, a practice that had been tolerated for decades. And then suddenly the crown wanted more revenue after the 7 Years' War. And not only did the merchants protest, but they actually picked up arms. So that's the sort of smuggling road to revolution, which was essential. But then the very conduct of the war, how does George Washington, take on the world's mightiest military force, ragtag, no organized military, no indigenous weapon supply, ability to produce gunpowder and so on. How do they take on the British? And the answer is smuggling. And this is provided by, bringing in supplies from the Caribbean, but also directly from Europe. The supplies in the Caribbean are provided by, neutral parties such as the Dutch, much to the anger and dismay of the British. And people like, John Brown, the actual founder of my university, Brown family made a fortune from the war, and no one more so than John Brown. Why? Because he basically specialized in what they called powder runs, and then charging George Washington enormous fees to pay for the war supplies. So, John Brown at the end of the American Revolution was probably the richest man in Rhode Island. So he was a war profiteer, but he was also a patriot in a sense. He's a beneficiary in so many different respects, but he's just one of many people who did well from war. And the conventional explanation is that the French intervened on behalf of the rebels, and that pushed the balance. But we forget that the French didn't intervene until they were convinced that the colonists could actually pull it off. And so there's that early phase in the conflict where smuggling was particularly essential. Then fast forward to the War of 1812. It's interesting, another war between the US and Great Britain, but in that case, it ends up in a stalemate. And part of the reason it's a stalemate is that so many American merchants turned out to be profiteers more than patriots. I mean, they actually were trading with the enemy, so much so that they were supplying, the British Army in Lower Canada. It turned out Vermont was more interested in trading rather than fighting. New York, people from New York State as well. People forget that one of the objectives of the war was to annex Canada and make Canada part of the United States. So part of the reason Canada is an independent country right now and not part of the US is precisely because that war ended up as a stalemate. And part of the reason for that was because US merchants were happy to supply the Brits for a profit. Last but not least, fast forward to the American Civil War. The South would not have had the audacity to try to break away from the North without having confidence in the funding power of cotton. If there'd been NGOs like Global Witness back then, they would have called it blood cotton. Today they call it blood diamonds. Well, there was no conflict commodity that's been more important in world history than cotton in terms of a war. The U.S. Civil War turned out to be far bloodier and far longer than anyone expected. And an important reason for that is the South was able to maintain its war machine by blockade running and smuggling cotton out in return for war supplies. Also, there's a lot of trading with the enemy across front lines. Again, that's sort of the other side of the Civil War that people often forget. We've often much of the rest of the world doesn't realize this, but more Americans died in the U.S. Civil War than any other war in U.S. history. And part of the reason is precisely because of its surprising longevity. Just looking at the official balance of power on the ground, you would think initially that this would be an easy conflict for the North to win, but in fact, the ability to raise revenue through cotton and trading with the enemy helps explain. But still, it wasn't enough to actually win the war on the part of the South, but it was enough to extend it because the blockade from the North was actually loose enough to get through it, to extend the war, but also tight enough to actually not let the South completely win. So just, in conclusion, there's a lot more continuity than change in the illicit trade and conflict link that we talk about today. Don't mean to suggest that there's no change at all. Obviously, there are some important factors, but from the overall historical perspective, I actually see more parallels rather than divergence today. There's no evidence today, I would say, that the insurgents are more profit-driven than some of their American predecessors. Then as now, it's very difficult to clearly differentiate between greed and grievance in motivating and sustaining a conflict. And it turns out the illicit economic underpinnings of so-called new wars are actually quite old. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now we have about 35 minutes left to this session. I thought I'd start by just throwing out a couple of questions to our panelists and see if what they have to say to that while people start thinking up their own questions. So 2 questions that I'll throw out, and you can pick up on whichever one you like. The first is, in a context in which smuggling can clearly serve a variety of purposes, does the institutionalization of smuggling in a particular context, is it a constructive or a worrying development? Does it lead to the criminalization of society and politics, or is it in fact an element of state building? And the second question to think about is, given that smuggling can shorten or prolong wars, are our attitudes towards smuggling in a particular situation based on which side we're on in a given conflict? So let me throw those open. You can pick up on, to our panelists, you can pick up on either one of those questions. So let's start with Annette.
Sure, thanks so much. First of all, also to the other panelists for their presentations, and thanks to Kate for the question. Maybe let me start with the second one. So you ask whether, or given that smuggling can shorten or prolong conflict, to what extent is our attitude here or position important? I think you can even add another aspect, which is what I found fascinating in both Shalaka's and Peter's presentation, which is about thinking how smuggling can actually, Shalaka mentioned, it keeps violence in check as well. Or Peter said that people prefer to trade rather than to fight. So I think there's this other dimension, not just of shortening or prolonging, but perhaps even of avoiding instability or violence from erupting. But the question then is at what cost? So I think that then is the same thing with your question about whether it can, whether it depends on the attitude. If it's shortening or prolonging, the question is more, what is the, I guess, what are the structural consequences? Or what is our aim in the end? Is it just to understand violence in that particular context, or is it understanding more long-term to what extent smuggling or any type of organized crime then also can undermine the prosperity of a society, to what extent it can have long-term implications in terms of the way forward? So I think it's not so much about just thinking about the particular conflict in a particular setting, but also what the long-term implications are, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Shalaka, do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I entirely agree with what Annette said, and just based on my own context, I feel like it's not necessarily just about prolonging or stopping the conflict, but can also really change the nature of the conflict itself, as I've discussed in my chapter. But also very often, so right now, because of COVID and the coup in Myanmar, the Indian state was provided with this very unique opportunity to actually close what is otherwise a porous border. And for the actors who did want to crack down on insurgency funding, that they very closely linked with smuggling, it gave them this opportunity, and it did reduce insurgency funding, which might seem like a good thing from the state's point of view. But if you speak to traders and businessmen there, they feel like even if the funding to the insurgents is currently going down, what this leads to, since it is the primary economy, is that it's going to lead to more violence and more people wanting to take to the gun, and is therefore going to have the exact opposite effect to what they're expecting. Yeah.
Okay, and Peter, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with Shalaka and Annette's comments. Don't have much more to add to that. I did like your initial question, Kate, about sort of a positive or negative legacy, I guess you would say, of the kind of after effects. I mean, it really is context dependent. It depends the situation, the place, the people involved. But I mean, in the U.S. story, I mean, it's clear that people, the narrative of U.S. founding is for freedom and liberty, but for some people that meant freedom to smuggle. And so after you establish the new nation, suddenly this brand new country needs to raise revenue and taxes and have some sort of functioning government. And so some of the same merchants who did well from war and were such patriotic providers to the war effort were very resistant to then paying taxes. And that included, Rhode Island was one of the last to agree to very modest. Hamilton tried to impose a very modest, impost tax on trade. And then fast forward to the more contemporary era, I wrote a book on Bosnia and the war economy there, especially in Sarajevo. And I mean, it's clear that there was kind of a turning of the social pyramid. I mean, the old elite, many of them had fled the country during the war, and many of those who did well from the war, who stayed, became a kind of new elite. And also the smuggling networks, channels, connections, and so on, so well developed during the war, persisted in the aftermath of war. So you shouldn't stop the analysis when the war ends, but look at the legacy of a criminalized war economy post-conflict. There's kind of a criminalized legacy, if you will. And then on your last point, the prolonging or shortening war, Shalaka, and that sense also emphasized that it changes the actual nature, the actual level of violence during the conflict itself. And I mean, I couldn't agree more in the sense that you look again at the Bosnia case, which was essentially a series of sieges. All urban areas basically besieged. And so you have micro war economies, variation within a small country. And, the more intensive the fighting in a place, the more difficult illicit trade. So Mostar was just so intense that it became very difficult to smuggle across the front lines, whereas Sarajevo was more stable, very violent, but much more stable. And the UN presence there actually greatly facilitated a more standardized everyday cross-border transaction. Depends on your perspective. I mean, you go to Bosnia today, and when I interviewed people there, they proudly talked about smuggling as having, basically saved the country, right? And so on. So you're right that there's kind of a normative dimension to this that we have to keep. It depends what perspective you're coming from.
Okay, I think we can open up to wider commentators here. Are there questions from the audience? Otherwise, I can also weigh in with some additional questions. If anybody wants to indicate a question, you can raise your Zoom hand or you can put something in the chat. Okay. While we're waiting for people to consider things, I thought I'd throw out a question, first of all, to Florian and Max, and then for others to weigh in on. Given the vast range of contexts and implications of smuggling, to what extent can we say that smuggling can be a field of study, or is it more effectively seen as a lens into other processes? Max or Florian, do you want to weigh in on that?
I can get started. No, that's an excellent question. And I think the idea, we really view this as a starting point. So in the book, we're talking a little bit about smuggling studies. I think we have to see to what extent there is a field that can be clearly defined. But I think what we were trying to do is that smuggling often appears quite literally at the margins. So it comes up in all sorts of disciplines, in different geographies, but we really wanted to bring all these people together who talk about smuggling and whatever they're looking at. And I think only the next few years will show whether this really, what kind of process this can kick off. But I think I personally at least learned a lot, and I thought there was was a surprising amount of similarities between the various chapters, and they speak incredibly well together to each other. So I'm very optimistic that there is a lot one can learn by bringing these various perspectives together. Max, I'm sure you have more thoughts on this.
Thanks for buying me time. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question. I mean, without going for aggressively ham-fisted metaphors, maybe it's more of a farm than a field. Like maybe I think it's got a variety of different activities going on that are, you know, separate enough that we should be careful to draw inference from one to the other, but have enough in common that I think it makes a lot of sense for people who study them in different contexts to come together and look at each other. So I do hope that that is one of the things that the book does. It certainly is one thing that I found really productive when editing these different chapters and reading them. I mean, I wrote a chapter in there on tobacco and cigarette smuggling. I found it really useful because looking at the other chapters on goods then really focused me to think, okay, so what type of good is this that I'm describing? What type of, you know, how does it relate back to these other ones? The other thing that, aside from the variety of kind of themes that run through the book that you also mentioned at the beginning, I found quite helpful, and that we try to highlight a little bit in the introduction as well, connects to the question earlier about institutionalization and criminalization, which is then nothing is born smuggling, right? So that, you know, no activity is in itself inherently illegal without a legal context that makes it so. No border exists without a legal and wider political context that makes it so. And I think that is something that kind of connects this field in a little bit, in the fact that there's always a political context that shapes the laws that make something smuggling, that shapes the kind of geographic structure of it. And I think that comes up through all these stories, and people come at them from different angles and different perspectives. So I think partly for that reason, I'm a little bit hesitant to say it's a perspective or it's a prism through which to see something. That the field makes more sense to me, but without implying that anyone is ever a smuggling expert, but maybe an expert of a subset of it that needs to come together with other people and compare notes.
Okay, well, we do have one brave soul who's come forward with a question. Bruno, would you like to unmute and give us your question?
Hi, Professor Meager and everyone. Thank you for having me, for having my question. So I read a lot of chapters in the book, not all of them, but I read the papers from, you know, all of you while I'm conducting a research on tobacco trading, actually tobacco smuggling between Paraguay and Brazil. So Brazil, it's had a lot of illegal counterfeit or just smuggled cigarette consumption. And something we have found while doing lots of interviews with high-level players in the area, especially diplomats, so there is a nexus between money laundering and cigarette smuggling, in the sense that the way that we trace reais in Brazil that go into the system is quite effective. So the cigarette trade generates all these untraceable reais that can then be sold to corrupt politicians and other corrupt actors who need to buy untraceable cash, let's say. So I was just wondering, I need some literature on that and some like other examples. So if any of your research have you find a similar case and similar examples to that, or if this is just like a brand new contribution that we've never seen, I don't know. Thanks for any information and recommendations you have.
Okay, do any of our panelists want to weigh in on that?
I could really quickly jump in just with two thoughts, an apology and a recommendation. I think the apology is, if Lauren and I have one regret, I think, about the Handbook of Smuggling, is that we don't have a chapter on finance and on that aspect of it. It's not an oversight. We really try to have one. Editing a handbook during global pandemic is not easy. So I think we need to be open about that. I think it's a really, really important aspect of it, and we don't mean to say that it's not there. Also, I think what you're describing is fascinating. And also, I think there is a fascinating literature on it, and it's not entirely new. I vaguely remember a chapter, or I think an article by Kate Marr, that points this out in the 90s already. If anyone on this panel knows the article I'm talking about and can help Bruno with the title, that'd be very helpful.
I wanted to commend Bruno for his cleverness in smuggling some personal research inquiries into a handbook, book launch on smuggling, but I'm not sure quite what you're referring to in terms of finance, but certainly the issue of finance came up on multiple occasions in a lot of the largely Francophone research, but there's some Anglophone research on smuggling in West Africa across Francophone, Anglophone borders, which very much focused on the financial issues. But it was less about untraceable cash than currency disparities, the shifting values of CFA francs and local currencies, and the ways in which smuggling circuits could be constructed to create profits going in each direction and to generate access to convertible versus unconvertible currencies. There's quite a lot of very interesting research in the West African franc and non-franc zone economies there. Latin America, I'm much less familiar with, but I'm wondering if Peter might know something about that. And I'm betting Bitcoin is going to generate a whole lot of really interesting literature on untraceable sources of cash and smuggling.
Yeah, just very briefly, not a particularly helpful comment, probably a little disappointing, but I'm still waiting for that key book on the illicit political economy of the tri-border region, you know, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, absolutely one of the world's most fascinating border regions. I've always been surprised at how overlooked it often is, other than by some sensationalistic journalists. I have a colleague in anthropology here, Yeva Yushonite, who wrote a book about the tri-border region, but it's really not on political economy. That's more about media coverage and so on. It's a fabulous book, though. You should take a look at that. I would say that the cigarette angle is particularly interesting because people, as Max knows, the image of cigarette smuggling is it's all about tax evasion, which it is. But in the case that you're looking at, it's also counterfeit cigarettes. So it's a doubly illicit, right? It's fake Marlboros as well as tax evasion, and then you add the money laundering angle. So I'd actually be curious to see, Bruno, what you come up with there. But I would encourage, particularly in that region, not looking at one commodity in isolation from the larger illicit political economy of the region, because there's a lot going on there. A lot of it's just consumer goods, untaxed. It's highly tolerated in many ways, so that's another interesting aspect. There's a political angle of terrorist financing that some people emphasize, especially in Washington, and so on. So it's a really fascinating case.
Okay, we have Joe Hanlon with a hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to raise a slight comment about my own war, which is Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, and to point out that the destinations of the trade and origins of the trade matter. And the biggest industry in Mozambique is transit trade of heroin. And the point is that none of that heroin stops in Cabo Delgado. That has always been a condition so that Mozambique doesn't get addicted, that it has to pass through. And it's always been tightly controlled by the government. Now, there's all sorts of other trades of timber and ivory going out, cigarettes and petrol coming in, and various other things. But the heroin, all of these trades are decades old, at least, some of them centuries old. The heroin trade has always been very tightly controlled by the government. So when the insurgency came along, what has happened is that it simply moved. So Cabo Delgado is in the very north of Mozambique. It's Delbat Dals coming down the coast, being transported to the beach and then over the overland to South Africa. So with the insurgents starting to control the roads, they simply moved it to Nampula province, 500 kilometers south, and it just simply disappeared. So it wasn't, the US keeps claiming the drugs are funding the insurgents. It's not, because the government simply, which controls the heroin trade, simply moved it. And I think there is a kind of global question about where is it is the value chain. And if the value chain is just a transit value chain, then it has a very different shape than a value chain which has an origin or a destination. And that's just really a comment, but I mean, by far the biggest smuggling in Mozambique is heroin.
Okay, I'm not sure there is a question there, but I don't know if anybody has responses to that. The whole idea that there are elements of smuggling that are often not points of origin or points of destination, but involve transit and have differential relationships with the state. Peter?
Yeah, I just, recommend an article written by an old friend and colleague of mine, Rich Fryman, called Just Passing Through. And it's basically focuses on precisely this issue of transit trade and certain countries specializing in moving stuff through. It's neither a source country or a destination country, though often stuff trickles out depending on how controlled it is. And as the commentator just said, in Mozambique historically, the heroin was tightly controlled by the government, so it didn't trickle out to the local population. But plenty of transit trade these days in some drugs does in fact trickle out. It's also in the context of an armed conflict, it's fascinating because there's often an assumption that where there's war, there's drugs. And the transit trade, the old traditional heroin route through the Balkan route, pre-war in Yugoslavia, tightly controlled by the government on its way to Western Europe. The war breaks out, that trade completely gets derailed. It moves out of the war area, actually. So that's a case of war inhibiting the drug trade, and it moves, further west to Albania and elsewhere. So basically, that's an example of drugs getting rerouted because of war.
Annette, you'd like to come in there?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just to add, I think first of all, it's super important to look at those different categories, right? What is a transit zone and where's the origin and the destination? But I think we also need to be very careful with not overusing them, because what we often see is how those categories then can also shift. So for example, in a book that I co-edited on the Transforming the War on Drugs, together with Juan Carlos Garcon Vergara, we look at, or there are chapters that look at, for example, the narco-geography. That's how Philip Robbins calls it. And that means basically we can see which areas, which regions are particularly vulnerable to being on that route. But there's also another contribution by Kwesi Arning and others to look at West Africa, again, the case of West Africa that was mentioned. There used to be a transit zone, but it's becoming actually more of a market. So here we see a shift of something that is still looked at through the lens of transit zone. And if we think about the state responses, the map that I showed before, where we see South America as kind of the origin, Europe, the US as the destination, and then West Africa, it's just where it's going through. That can also be problematic if we then overlook that actually it's local groups that are becoming more powerful, that take over the market as well, where there's also more consumption locally. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that all these categories can also shift, and that therefore we need to be really, really careful with how rigidly we apply them, and also in terms of interventions, policy responses, to what extent they're careful enough with really unpacking that.
Florian, over to you.
Thank you. And just adding to what all three of you just said, I think while we talk a lot about kind of how conflict and smuggling connect, there's also an important disconnect that you pointed out in your comment, that conflict is also highly disruptive also for smuggling. And it's not necessarily that conflict is this creates this beautiful ecosystem for crime, but many traditional transit routes in particular are shifted and kind of try to avoid conflict, because conflict is ultimately much more expensive from a business perspective to deal with. So I think that makes the transit angle particularly interesting in a conflict space. And I think the other interesting point you made, and that comes through, for instance, also in Shalaka's chapter, but also David's chapter, is that it's also worth looking at state actors beyond non-state actors. So I think there is this automatic, one very quickly looks at smuggling and then thinks about insurgents, but of course, state actors to often also benefit as much, at least, as insurgents do. And I think, yeah, it's also important to not ignore that and how that fits into the ecosystem. Thank you.
Just to add one other element of that, I think it's also very interesting the ways in which thinking about transit draw attention to the very complex structuring of smuggling. It's not always just the movement across one border from one site across the border to the destination market. Often there are very complex circuits. In West Africa, also Goodhand's work on Afghanistan and the surrounding regions look at the various ways in which often there are import zones, transit zones, export zones that may involve a number of countries. And these can be sources of huge income. For example, the entrepot economies, very small economies in West Africa, like Togo, Benin Republic, the Gambia, but sources of conflict either with the state or among business people along the way or in destination zones, so that one single smuggling route can have very different types of conflict and well-being implications. And a number of actors along the way, transit specialists who neither import nor export in the international sense, but who also do specialize in transiting a good that has been imported to across a border so that somebody else can move it on to the destination market. So very complex geographies and political economies of smuggling routes and circuits that come into looking at these things in this way. Do we have any other questions to raise, either from the YouTube audience or from the Zoom floor? I think there are some definite, oh, looks like something, no questions from the Zoom floor, sorry, from the YouTube floor. So some have said we call these transit systems, these overall smuggling systems, a border criminal ecology, but I think he has just walked into Max and Florian's trap right there. So why a border criminal ecology? Is it necessarily criminal, as Peter and Shalaka have pointed out, the activities going on, certainly from the perspective of states who want to control these things, we have criminality. But from people who earn their livelihoods from them, or on the part of states who actually are financing something they consider a freedom fight or a liberation fight rather than a criminal activity or an attempt to overthrow, we have very different perspectives on whether this is criminal or not. And one question I'd like to throw out then, often when we're looking at conflict and criminality, in the context of smuggling situations, it's assumed that there are somehow rebels on one hand against the state on the other, and the question is the extent to which smuggling finances the good guys or the bad guys when we decide whether it's criminal or not. But a lot of the greed and grievance literature and a lot of the perspectives on smuggling currently is much less about whether a particular state or rebel are considered good or bad guys, and much more about struggles over controlling the regulatory structure of the international market. What do we feel about having these people in the international market versus other people? So forms of smuggling that threaten the international market are often cast as criminal, and forms of smuggling that are not seen as that worrying, such as the smuggling that helped George Washington come to power, everybody would say, no, 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 that was good smuggling. So connecting with the other question, I'm wondering the extent to which contemporary processes of economic reconstruction are shifting our understanding of who are the good guys and the bad guys in these smuggling ecosystems, and whether it matters not just which political side we're on, this state or that rebel group, but also on which ideological side we find ourselves. So aid agencies have particular views on smuggling. International organizations have particular views on smuggling. To what extent do you think views about smuggling are now shaped more by what the international community wants rather than what this rebel or that state wants? Any thoughts from the panel on that?
Maybe I can jump in. I think that links a little bit to your previous question about the institutionalization and whether this is constructive or varying, because I think it's not so much about what type of smuggling is viewed good or bad, or whether this is a conflict or not, but really who's actually affected within that. And that's what I also meant when I talked about the moral economy in addition to the political economy. So for example, if we think about the blurring of lines, even of who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, right? If we think about the small-scale smugglers who have to pay taxes to the large-scale ones, the powerful brokers, I think here the question is, well, if it becomes more professionalized, the ones who win are usually the powerful brokers in the international sphere and that accumulate more wealth, whereas the small-scale ones lose out. And this is exactly a problem that we see if we compare that at the international versus the local level. So then when we think about actors like aid agencies, in my view, the question is not so much whether they would promote or support certain types of smuggling, but really understanding what are the implications for the local livelihoods. How can people's livelihoods still be sustained while trying to disrupt the large-scale smuggling? So I think there's a question of nuances within types of smuggling, across types of smuggling. That's why the intersections are so important. And then understanding what the impacts are depending on where we are within that supply chain.
Okay, I'm going to go to Shalaka and then we can round up with Max.
So not about international views on smuggling as your question was, but what I observed was that even local views on what constitutes smuggling and what doesn't really did shape what was okay and what was not okay. And this was really highlighted by whether or not people even use the word smuggling. When I first started doing research, they'd say traders and businessmen and then smugglers, but all of it was illegal or informal, like all of it was technically smuggling. But the word smuggler was associated just with people who were involved in drugs or guns. And what's interesting is that it really, this is the local people who decide who's a smuggler, but also the state and the people who are trying to thwart smuggling, they do draw these lines on how they're going to interfere, and they do use this very varied vocabulary, which I think is shaping views, at least at a local level.
And we have a comment also from Joe Hanlon that connects with that, in which he points out that the trade in ivory, which has been going on in the north of Mozambique for a long time, is recently regarded as smuggling because international perceptions of the legitimacy of trading ivory have reframed how a trade of ivory, even across a border or within a border, may be viewed. Max, do you want to give us the final word?
I mean, Florian already put in the chat that Christoph Tieteke has a really, really great chapter in the volume that tries to dive into these local perceptions of smuggling a bit more. The other obvious chapter in the volume that speaks to this really interesting, obviously, is Kate's around smuggling ideologies and how different perspectives around economic development and kind of global economic orders have then reverberated down or influenced how we've thought about smuggling. And I think that is one thing that we really felt strongly in the book, with this kind of idea of centering it, right? So this idea that so often smuggling is a consequence of another discussion. So often it sits at the margins of other discussions. So I think moving away from that, and I think so much of the work by the people on this panel does that so well, by kind of going down to the smuggling as a center and then trying to understand it from there, rather than kind of having it as a consequence of a wider framework that is largely around something else. I think if our ideologies, our position on a kind of wider global control of global trade and so on shapes how we think about smuggling. But I think also one of the things that we might have to be a bit more vigilant around is how industry and interests start shaping that as well, and not just in the context of conflict actors. I find that, again, looking at cigarette smuggling is a really interesting illustration of that, because there's been an enormous amount of work on cigarette smuggling that is produced and funded, or in one way or the other influenced by the tobacco industry. And it is very interesting that that work also clearly distinguishes between the good smugglers and the bad smugglers, or tries to highlight certain problems more than others, is very particular on the various dangers of illicit local production, and is strangely silent on the vast oversupply of some countries with formal cigarettes that then disappear to the conflict zones nearby. And the interesting thing that has come out of that is a small, very tight-knit research community that largely focuses on kind of tobacco control and doesn't really engage with the rest of the smuggling literature, but has gotten very good at looking at where does funding come from? Why do we write about the things we write about? How have industry interests shaped how we think about smuggling? And I don't think tobacco is the only good for which this is important. And I think that is, again, one of those little things where one research community has set an interesting standard that I think a large part of the other industry can learn from. And I'll pass back to Kate with that.
All right. Well, I think we're really just getting going here, and we could probably carry on talking about smuggling with all these smuggling wonks for another hour and a half. But our time is formally up. So I would like to say thank you, Max, and thank you, Florian, and thank you to Peter Andreas, to Annette Eidler, and to Shalaka Thakur for this really engaging conversation to get us into this book. This is a book very much that has shone a spotlight on smuggling, which for smugglers might be a bit counterproductive, but I think it does give us an opportunity to really dig into what smuggling can teach us about the world, about international political economy, about the relationships between communities and livelihoods and informal and formal processes, about state building and state destruction. All of the things that development is all about. So perhaps we could just say that smuggling helps us understand development. And I would like to say go out and buy the book, but you don't have to because it's free and open access. So go out and buy it if you want a hard copy, or go out and download it if you just want to read it for free, but I highly recommend it. And all of the chapters that have been summarized here and all of the other ones, I think you will find it illuminating regardless of what you study and of which countries you're interested in. So thank you very much to Max and Florian, especially, for giving us this fantastic book to really hone our understandings of development and its illicit edges.